Good morning, Kim Hammer, pastor, Saline Baptist Church down in Tull, outside of Benton, with your morning devotion taken today from the book of Exodus, chapter 10. It is the latter part of the chapter, and we're coming up on the plague of darkness. This is interesting because God told Moses, basically, don't have any contact with Pharaoh, you're just going to do it. And so God called Moses and told him to stretch out his arms. And when he did, there was darkness over Egypt for 3 days. You ever heard the expression that you can feel the darkness? Well, this is where it comes from, because the Bible indicates that the darkness was so thick that you could feel it. The interesting thing is that it was only on the Egyptians, it was not on the Israelites. To illustrate this, I thought about houses. Whenever the electricity goes off in neighborhoods, you think about houses that have generators and how they have the benefit of light because they have those generators. Well, with the Egyptians that lived among the pharaohs, it was the same thing. They had the benefit of light, but the Egyptians lived in the dark, and lived in the dark for 3 days. Now, we as creatures, we as humans, are created with the need for light, just similar to the light that's coming up behind me every morning. That's something that we look forward to. It's something that we actually kind of crave and that we need. And you ever been around somebody, or have you ever been in a situation where you've been in the dark for so long that it begins to affect your attitude, your outlook, and your emotions? You might even experience depression and other, medical side effects or emotional side effects. Well, for 3 solid days, the Egyptians were in total darkness that just kind of like an envelope, it just surrounded them and they couldn't get away from it. And then finally, we find at the end of this, now, Pharaoh did call for Moses, and he said, you can go and you can worship, but you've got to leave your cattle. Again, Pharaoh was trying to plea bargain with Moses regarding who could go and who couldn't go. Prior to that, he said, you can go, but you got to leave your wives and your kids behind. And Moses said, no, we're going to take everything. And, he ended up not going, even though Moses said he could last minute, but Pharaoh changed his mind. Well, this time Pharaoh was telling Moses that he could go, but he's got to leave his livestock behind. And I think there's maybe 3 or 4 reasons why that might have been the case. For one, Egypt had no livestock because they lost it in the previous plagues and there was none around. So they had none, but Israel had plenty. Secondly, it was essential that Moses be able to take the livestock because that's what they were going to use to worship the Lord. And that's what they were going to use to survive for 3 days as a food supply for them while they're out in the wilderness. And so Pharaoh, trying to do a strategic move on Moses, said you can go, but you can't take your livestock with you. Why? A, he probably would have kept it for himself. B, he knew that Moses needed it in order to do what he needed to do to worship the Lord, because Moses had told him that before. But then also C, it's because he knew that they would have to come back because they wouldn't have food enough in order to be able to survive without their livestock. So Pharaoh was trying to work this from a humanistic point of view, and God is working Pharaoh from a spiritual point of view. Of course, Moses said, no, if we can't go and all of our livestock go with us, then we're not going to go. At this, Pharaoh had hit his tipping point, and he told Moses, don't ever come back into my presence again. And, this is kind of like Pharaoh is finally getting to the point where enough is enough, but he's got one other plague that is about to come that is going to be the biggest plague of all that he will experience. Now, one thing Moses had told the people, you need to ask your neighbors for their silver, for their gold. While the darkness experience was going on, he told them, you need to ask your neighbors for their silver or their gold. This goes back to chapter 3 and verse 22, that where as Moses was being prepared by God to go into the presence of Pharaoh to perform these miracles, one of the things that God told Moses was to tell the people, there'll come a time when you need to ask your neighbors for silver and gold, and you're going to be in a favorable position with them to the point they're going to give you what you ask for. Part of it's going to be because they're sick and tired of them because of all the plagues that have been brought on, but the other part of it is because God was positioning them to receive the silver and gold from their neighbors, because it would be an economic engine to them as they went off to start in a land that he had prepared for them. Now, one other thing I want you to notice, in the previous couple plagues, we've had given to us indication that the officials of Pharaoh were growing favorable to Moses, which meant that they were growing favorable to the Israelite people. I don't really think that the people themselves had a problem among themselves. It was a battle of the leadership between Pharaoh and between Moses. And the followers of Pharaoh were beginning to soften because they realized that God was playing a very preeminent part in their life, and that this truly was being done of God, and they had grown to the point that they respected Moses because he was standing for his faith, whereas Pharaoh was standing for himself. And that's an important distinction we need to get out of today's lesson. That is this: if you're going to stand, don't stand for yourself. Stand for the Lord, and the Lord will work everything out. Now, we find that Moses was highly regarded by Pharaoh's officials and the people, and he tells Pharaoh and the officials about the death of the firstborn that was coming. You would have thought that after the 9 previous plagues, and they're dealing with the plague of the darkness, that by this time, if Moses said, this is the plague that's coming, it would change your attitude, and it might change your outlook. And the thing that's interesting is it says that Moses left hot with anger. Moses left hot with anger. I think this shows the compassionate side of Moses. Why was he mad? Was he mad because Pharaoh wasn't going to let him go? No, not so much. I mean, yeah, sure, he was mad about that. Was he mad because Pharaoh had promised him so many times that he could go, and then he changed his mind? He lied to him, and he said, no, you can't go. Was he mad because Pharaoh wouldn't listen to God, even though God had shown himself so many times? In my opinion, I think the reason Moses left hot with anger was because Moses knew that he had done all 9 of those miracles that God had empowered him to do, and all of them dealt with stuff. They either dealt with materialistic possession, that did deal with the physical portion of the body, but no death experienced because of the boils, at least to humanity. The livestock, died. I think what got Moses' anger so hot was that he told Pharaoh, this is going to involve the babies. This is going to involve the firstborn. This is going to involve human life. And Pharaoh took such a hard stance that he said no. And when he said no, I think the reason Moses got mad to the point that he burned with anger was because he knew the pain and the anguish and the sorrow that was about to come upon the innocent Egyptian people because of a stiff-necked leader of a Pharaoh. And that shows the compassionate side of Moses, that he got mad because he understood the value of human life, and he had a person who didn't, that was willing to make human life expendable in order to maintain his pride. Because just previous, if you remember, Moses asked him, how long and how much and what will it take to humble you? Well, we're about to find out.